You guys, we're going to start at page 168 of The Giver. The most terrifying thing was the planes. By now, days had passed. Jonas no longer knew how many. The journey had become automatic. The sleep by days, hidden in the underbrush and trees, the finding of water, the careful division of scraps of food, augmented by what he could find in the fields, and the endless miles on the bicycle by night. His leg muscles were taut now. They ached when he settled himself to sleep, but they were stronger, and he stopped now less often to rest. Sometimes he paused and lifted Gabriel down for a brief bit of exercise, running down the road or through a field together in the dark. But always, when he returned, strapped the uncomplaining toddler into the seat again and remounted, his legs were ready. So he had enough strength of his own and had not needed what the giver might have provided had there been time. But when the planes came, he wished that he could have received the courage. He knew they were search planes. They flew so low that they woke him with the noise of their engines, and sometimes, looking out and up fearfully from the hiding places, he could almost see the faces of the searchers. He knew that they could not see color, and that their flesh, as well as Gabriel's light golden curls, would be no more than smears of gray against the colorless foliage. But he remembered from his science and technology studies at school that the search planes used heat-seeking devices, which could identify body warmth and would hone in on two humans cuddled in shrubbery. So always, when he heard the aircraft sound, he reached to Gabriel and transmitted memories of snow, keeping some for himself. Together, they became cold, and when the planes were gone, they would shiver, holding each other until sleep came again. Sometimes, urging the memories into Gabriel, Jonas felt that they were more shallow, a little weaker than they had been. It was what he had hoped, what he and the giver had planned, and as he moved away from the community, he would shed the memories and leave them behind for the people. But now when he needed them, when the planes came, he tried hard to cling to what he still had of cold and to use it for survival. Usually the aircraft came by day and they were hiding, but he was alert at night too on the road, always listening intently for the sound of engines. Even Gabriel listened and would call out, "Plane, plane," sometimes before Jonas heard the terrifying noise. When the aircraft searchers came, as they did occasionally during the night as they rode, Jonas sped to the nearest tree or bush, dropped to the ground, and made himself and Gabriel cold. But it was sometimes a frightening close call. As he pedaled through the nights, through isolated landscapes now, with the communities far behind and no sign of human habitation around him or ahead, he was constantly vigilant, looking for the next nearest hiding place, should the sound of engines come. But the frequency of planes diminished. They came less often and flew, when they did come, less slowly, as if the search had become haphazard and no longer hopeful. Finally, there was an entire day and night when they did not come at all. Chapter 22, page 171. Now the landscape was changing. It was a subtle change, hard to identify at first. The road was narrower and bumpy, apparently no longer tended by road crews. It was harder suddenly to balance on the bike as the front wheel wobbled over the stones and ruts. One night, Jonas fell when the bike jolted to a sudden stop against a rock. He grabbed instinctively for Gabriel, and the new child, strapped tightly to a seat, was uninjured, only frightened when the bike fell to its side. But Jonas's ankle was twisted, and his knees were scraped and raw, blood seeping through his torn trousers. Painfully, he righted himself and the bike and reassured Gabe. Tentatively, he began to ride in daylight. He had forgotten the fear of the searchers, who seemed to have had diminished into the past. But now there were new fears. The unfamiliar landscape held hidden, unknown perils. Trees became numerous, and the forests behind the road were dark and thick with mystery. They saw streams more frequently now and stopped often to drink. Jonas carefully washed his injured knee, wincing as he rubbed at the raw flesh. The constant ache of his swollen ankle was eased when it soaked occasionally in the cold water that rushed through the roadside gullies. He was newly aware that Gabriel's safety depended entirely upon his own continued strength. They saw their first waterfall, and for the first time, wildlife. Plane, plane, Gabriel called, and Jonas turned swiftly into the trees. Though he had not seen plane in days, and he did not hear an aircraft engine now, when he stopped the bicycle in the shrubbery and turned to grab Gabe, he saw the small, chubby arm pointing toward the sky. Terrified, he looked up, but it was not a plane at all. Though he had never seen one before, he identified it from his fading memories. The giver had given him so often. It was a bird. Soon there were many birds along the way, soaring overhead, calling. They saw deer, and once beside the road, looking at them curiously and unafraid, a small reddish-brown creature with a thick tail, whose name Jonas did not know. He slowed the bike, and they stared at one another until the creature turned away and disappeared into the woods. All of it was new to him. After a life of sameness and predictability, he was awed by the surprises that lay beyond each curve of the road. He slowed the bike again and again to look with wonder at wildflowers, to enjoy the throaty warble of a new bird nearby, or merely to watch the way wind shifted the leaves in the trees. During his 12 years in the community, he had never felt such simple moments of exquisite happiness. But there were desperate fears building in him now as well. The most relentless of his fears was that they would starve. Now they had left the cultivated fields behind them. It was almost impossible to find food. They finished the meager store of potatoes and carrots they had saved from the last agricultural area, and now they were always hungry. Jonas knelt by a stream and tried without success to catch a fish with his hands. Frustrated, he threw rocks into the water, knowing even as he did so that it was useless. Finally, in desperation, he fashioned a makeshift net, looping the strands of Gabriel's blanket around a curved stick. After countless tries, the net yielded 2 flopping silvery fish. Methodically, Jonas hacked them to pieces with a sharp rock and fed the raw shreds to himself and Gabriel. They ate some berries and tried without success to catch a bird. At night, while Gabriel slept beside him, Jonas lay awake, tortured by hunger, and remembered his life in the community where meals were delivered to each dwelling every day. He tried to use flagging power of his memory to recreate meals and managed brief, tantalizing fragments, banquets with huge roasted meals and meats, birthday parties with thick frosted cakes and lush fruits picked and eaten, sun-warmed and dripping from trees. But when the memory's glimpses subsided, he was left with a gnawing, painful emptiness. Jonas remembered suddenly and grimly the time in his childhood when he had been chastised for misusing a word. The word had been starving. "You've never been starving," he had been told. "You will never be starving." And now he was. If he stayed in the community, he would not be. And we're going to stop there at the very top of page 174.